They say the Middle East has always been at war, that its conflicts are ancient, religious, tribal, and inevitable, that chaos is simply part of its identity, a storm that has always been there. But that story is convenient. It allows the real engineers of destruction to hide behind the idea of ancient hatred, because the truth is much darker. The Middle East didn't collapse on its own. It was dismantled in slow motion, piece by piece, border by border, generation by generation. Lines were drawn by people who had never set foot in the region. Leaders were removed not because they were cruel, but because they were independent. And every time stability tried to emerge, someone, somewhere, pushed it back into chaos. Coups became tools, wars became strategies, sanctions became weapons, and at the center of it all was an empire that spoke the language of freedom while quietly building a prison made of oil, dollars, and blood. This is the story of how America broke the Middle East, the methods, the motives, the psychology, and the reason the chaos never stops. Let's go back to the beginning. 1908, Persia, the modern-day Iran. A British company struck oil, not just any oil, but the kind that could power navies, fuel entire industries, and build empires. Within a decade, the British had carved out the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, the ancestor of BP. They didn't ask for permission, they didn't negotiate, they simply took what they wanted, and the world watched quietly. Then came World War I, and with it, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which had ruled the Middle East for centuries. Suddenly, centuries of local governance and tradition were upended. The people of the region were not consulted. Their destinies were decided with pens and maps on distant desks. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 was a masterclass in cold calculation. Two men, armed with little more than arrogance, drew lines across deserts and mountains, ignoring tribes, ethnicities, and religious loyalties. Straight lines, cutting across the landscape, creating countries that had never existed before. Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine. Nations designed for European convenience, not human reality. And beneath every line, the real prize lay hidden: oil. The British took Iraq and Iran. The French claimed Syria and Lebanon. Together, they ensured that no unified Arab state could rise to challenge their dominance. Divide, conquer, extract. It was a system built for control. But the British Empire was dying, exhausted and bleeding after 2 world wars, and in the shadows, waiting with ambition and resources, was a younger, hungrier power, America. A nation that would take the mantle of empire and rewrite the rules of the Middle East in its own image.
President Harry Truman stands before Congress and declares a new doctrine. The world, he says, is divided between 2 ways of life: freedom and tyranny, democracy and communism. It sounds noble. It sounds righteous. It even sounds inevitable. But beneath the idealism lies a harsher truth. Every country on earth has now become a battlefield. Sovereignty is a concept to be managed, not respected. And the Middle East, rich in oil, strategically positioned between Europe, Asia, and Africa, quickly becomes the most critical chessboard of all. The United States is determined that the Soviets will never control it. To secure its position, America makes deals with devils, not one, but many. The Shah of Iran, the King of Saudi Arabia, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, Hosni Mubarak in Egypt. Men who rule with iron fists, crushing dissent, silencing opposition, and hoarding wealth while their people suffer. Brutal regimes, corrupt monarchs, tyrants. Yet they are America's dictators, and that changes everything. As long as they keep the oil flowing and keep the Soviet influence at bay, Washington looks the other way. Human rights, democracy, justice, none of it matters. What matters is control, influence, and the invisible lines of power drawn across the region. This is the birth of American hypocrisy in the Middle East. Freedom for some, dictatorship for others, all justified by ideology. And it works for a while. The chessboard is set, the pieces move as they are told. But as history has shown, even the best-laid plans have consequences, and the cost is almost always paid by those who have no say in the game. But not every leader is willing to play the game. Some believe their nations deserve dignity, control, and independence. Mohammad Mossadegh was one of them, a democratically elected prime minister of Iran, educated, progressive, widely respected, and genuinely loved by his people, and that made him dangerous. Because in 1951, Mossadegh did the unthinkable. He nationalized Iran's oil. He told the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the British corporation that had been draining Iran's wealth for decades, that the era of colonial extraction was over. From that moment on, Iranian oil would belong to Iranian people, to its people. The British were furious, outraged. The idea that a Middle Eastern nation could claim sovereignty over its own resources was unacceptable. They wanted Mossadegh gone, fast. However, their empire was weakening and their power was fading, so they turned to Washington for help. And the CIA listened. Operation Ajax, 1953. A masterclass in covert regime change. The CIA, working hand in hand with British intelligence, orchestrated a coup designed to look like a spontaneous uprising. They bribed military officers. They paid mobs and protesters to flood the streets. They planted stories in newspapers. They spread rumors, misinformation, and chaos. Then they blamed all of it on Mossadegh. Within weeks, the plan succeeded. Mossadegh was arrested, his democratic government collapsed, and in his place the West installed the Shah, a monarch loyal to the United States, loyal to Britain, and loyal to the flow of oil. For the next 25 years, the Shah ruled with absolute power. His secret police, the SAVAC, became infamous for torture, disappearances, and executions. Iran's wealth flowed outward into Western banks and corporations, while ordinary Iranians watched their hopes for democracy fade into the shadows. But revolutions don't die. They simmer. They wait. The anger grows quietly, year after year, until it becomes impossible to contain. In 1979, it finally erupted. The Islamic Revolution swept through Iran. The Shah fled. Ayatollah Khomeini rose to power. American diplomats were taken hostage, and in an instant, Iran transformed from a Western ally into America's most unshakable enemy in the Middle East. All because of a coup. All because one leader dared to challenge foreign control of his country's oil. This became the blueprint, the unspoken rule of empire. When a leader refuses to bow, you remove them, and the world pretends it was destiny. Iran was only one battlefield, a warning shot. The real prize, the crown jewel of American strategy, was Saudi Arabia, a nation sitting on a sea of oil so vast it could shape the entire global economy. In 1945, as World War II drew to a close, President Franklin Roosevelt met King Abdul Aziz aboard a U.S. warship anchored in the Suez Canal. Two men from completely different worlds made a deal that would silently reshape the next century. The terms were simple. America would guarantee the survival of the Saudi monarchy. In return, Saudi Arabia would price and sell its oil exclusively in U.S. dollars. From this handshake was born the Petrodollar, a system that would become the invisible backbone of American power. And it changed everything. Because once Saudi oil was tied to the dollar, every other OPEC nation followed. Every country on earth that needed oil, the fuel powering cars, factories, militaries, and entire civilizations, now needed dollars first. This meant they needed access to American banks, American markets, and American approval. The dollar didn't become the world's reserve currency because of gold. Gold was abandoned. It didn't become supreme because of trade. Trade was secondary. The dollar became king because it was the only currency accepted for the one resource no country could live without: oil. And at the center of this arrangement stood Saudi Arabia, the enforcer of the system, the linchpin holding together Americans' global economic dominance. Human rights didn't matter. Political systems didn't matter. Morality didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the lifeline of oil and the stability of the petrodollar. It didn't matter that Saudi Arabia was a theocratic monarchy. It didn't matter that they executed dissidents in public squares. It didn't matter that women were treated as second-class citizens for decades. It didn't matter that the kingdom exported extremist ideology across the world. It didn't even matter that 15 of the 19 hijackers on 9/11 were Saudi nationals. None of it mattered, because the Saudis kept the petrodollar alive. And keeping that system alive meant keeping American influence unchallenged. This was the true foundation of U.S. power in the Middle East. Not democracy, not freedom, not alliances built on shared values. Just oil and dollars, the two pillars holding up the modern American empire.
1979. The Soviet Union invades Afghanistan, hoping to expand its influence deeper into Central Asia. The world watches, but one agency sees more than a crisis. It sees an opportunity. The CIA realizes it can bleed the Soviets without ever firing a shot. They can turn Afghanistan into a graveyard for an empire, the same way Vietnam had once bled America dry. But Washington knows it cannot confront Moscow directly. That would spark a global conflict no one would survive. So they do what great powers always do. They find proxies. Enter the MUJAHIDEEN, fragmented groups of Afghan fighters resisting Soviet occupation. Men hardened by mountains, tribal loyalty, and centuries of foreign invasions. The CIA, working alongside Pakistan's ISI and Saudi Arabia's deeply ideological networks, begins pouring billions of dollars into the war. Weapons, cash, training camps, intelligence, anything that will keep the Soviets trapped in the Afghan mountains. And among the foreign volunteers who rush to join the fight is a wealthy young Saudi, Osama bin Laden, a man inspired, radicalized, and eventually armed under a CIA-backed operation designed to weaken America's greatest rival. The strategy works, brutally. The Soviets are bled from the inside out. Afghanistan becomes their Vietnam, a swamp of endless ambushes, collapsing morale, and mounting casualties. By 1989, the once mighty Red Army had withdrawn in humiliation. America celebrates. The Cold War map shifts. America chalks up another victory. But no one in Washington stops to ask the most important question. What happens next? What happens to the tens of thousands of fighters now trained, armed, and battle-hardened? What happens to the stockpiles of weapons scattered across a shattered country? What happens when you build an army of true believers and then abandon them in a vacuum of chaos? The CIA never answers those questions. They pack up and leave. And in the ruins of post-war Afghanistan, something dark begins to form. The Taliban rises, fueled by ideology and empowered by the weapons left behind. Al-Qaeda emerges from the shadows, built by veterans of America's proxy war. The same fighters the U.S. funded, trained, and armed to kill the Soviets now turn their guns on America. Embassies are bombed, soldiers are targeted, and eventually the world watches the skyline of New York burn. This is the law of unintended consequences, the empire's favorite excuse. But maybe these consequences aren't unintended at all. Maybe chaos is not a failure of the system. Maybe for some, chaos is the system.
August 1990. Saddam Hussein, the dictator America supported during the Iran-Iraq War, invaded Kuwait. And suddenly, he's the enemy. The Gulf War is swift. American tanks roll through the desert. Iraq is pushed out of Kuwait, but Saddam stays in power. Then come the sanctions, brutal, comprehensive, designed to cripple Iraq's economy. And they do. But not Saddam. He's fine. His palaces still gleam. His soldiers still march. It's the Iraqi people who suffer. Hospitals run out of medicine. Children die from preventable diseases. 500,000 dead, according to some estimates. When asked if the sanctions were worth it, U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright said, "We think the price is worth it. 500,000 lives. Worth it." But the sanctions don't stop Saddam, so America decides on a different approach: the invasion. The stated reason: weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, nuclear ambitions, an imminent threat. None of it was true. No WMDs were found. The intelligence was fabricated. The threat was invented. But the invasion happened anyway. Baghdad falls. Saddam is captured and executed. And Iraq is destroyed. Not just militarily, institutionally. The Iraqi army was disbanded overnight. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, armed and trained, were suddenly unemployed. The government collapses, infrastructure crumbles, and into that vacuum stepped something darker: insurgency, sectarian violence, chaos, and eventually ISIS. The Islamic State didn't appear out of nowhere.
It was born from the wreckage of Iraq. Former Iraqi officers trained by Saddam became its commanders. Extremists radicalized by the American occupation became its soldiers. ISIS wasn't an accident. It was a predictable outcome, a direct consequence, and America knew it, or should have. But maybe that was the point. Keep the region unstable. Keep them fighting each other. Keep them weak. Because a strong, unified Middle East is a threat. A broken one is profitable.
2011. A fruit vendor sets himself on fire, and the Middle East explodes. The Arab Spring. Millions take the streets in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Syria, Yemen, and Bahrain. They demand freedom, democracy, an end to dictatorship. And for a moment, it feels like change is possible. But America doesn't want change. America wants control. In Egypt, they support the revolution until it threatens their interests. Then they quietly back the military coup that restores dictatorship. In Libya, they bomb Gaddafi's forces, overthrow his government, and then leave. No plan, no reconstruction, just chaos. Libya becomes a failed state. Slave markets return. Militias rule. Refugees flee across the Mediterranean by the thousands. In Syria, the uprising turns into a civil war. America supports rebel groups. Russia supports Assad. Proxy war erupts. 500,000 die. Millions flee. And America once again walks away. Yemen, Bahrain, same story. Revolutions crushed, dictators restored, or endless war. The Arab Spring didn't fail because the people failed. It failed because the powers that be couldn't allow it to succeed.
Let's be clear. This wasn't incompetence. This wasn't ignorance. This was a strategy. The goal was never stability, never peace, never democracy. The goal was control. Controlled chaos. A region too divided to unify, too weak to resist, too dependent to break free. The U.S. wanted oil. They wanted military bases. They wanted weapons sales. They wanted a region that could never threaten American dominance. And they got it. They turned the Middle East into a market for American weapons. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Iraq, all armed by the United States. Trillions of dollars in sales. They turned it into a military outpost. Over 40 U.S. bases are scattered across the region. Troops in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Kuwait, Bahrain. They turned it into a chessboard where they play Russia, China, and Iran against each other. And they turned it into a warning. Cross us, and this is what happens to you. This is the psychology of empire. Not conquest, control. Not domination, dependency. Not peace, profitable chaos. But behind every strategy, every coup, every war, there are people, real people. Millions dead. Not soldiers, civilians, children, families. In Iraq alone, over 500,000. In Syria, 500,000. In Yemen, hundreds of thousands. Millions displaced, refugees flooding into Europe, into neighboring countries, into camps where they wait for a future that never comes. Generations traumatized, children who grow up knowing only war, who watched their parents die, who learned that the world is cruel and that no one is coming to save them. And the psychological scars run deeper than any bullet.
You can't quantify the trauma of a child who watched their home being bombed. You can't measure the rage of a man who lost his family to a drone strike. But that rage doesn't disappear. It festers. It spreads. It becomes the next generation of extremism, and the cycle continues.
Today, the Middle East is still burning. Iran is isolated, sanctioned, and on the brink of war with Israel. A shadow war of assassinations, cyber attacks, and proxy battles. Saudi Arabia and Iran are locked in a regional Cold War. Yemen is the battlefield. Millions starve while superpowers fund both sides. Israel and Palestine remain locked in an endless cycle of violence. Gaza is an open-air prison. The West Bank is occupied, and every few years, war erupts again. American bases still dot the region. American troops still patrol. American weapons still flow. And now, a new player enters the game: China. Brokering deals, building influence, offering an alternative to American dominance. Russia is there too, in Syria, in Libya, filling the spaces America leaves behind. The great game continues. The pieces change, but the blood remains the same. But here is the final warning. Empires don't last forever. The Romans thought they would. The British thought they would. The Soviets thought they would. But every empire that builds its foundation on domination eventually collapses under the weight of its own contradictions. Because you can't export chaos and expect peace at home. You can't destabilize the world and remain stable yourself. You can't bomb people into submission and expect them to forget. The chickens always come to roost. America broke the Middle East, but in doing so, it broke something inside itself too. It spent trillions on wars while its own infrastructure crumbled. It armed dictators while its own people lost faith in democracy. It spread violence abroad and watched it return in different forms. This is the price of empire, not just what you do to others, but what you become in the process. And the lesson, the warning? When superpowers play chess with human lives, everyone loses. The pawns are sacrificed, the board is destroyed, and eventually the king falls too. The Middle East is not a tragedy. It's a crime scene, and the fingerprints are everywhere. The question is, will anyone ever be held accountable? Or will the world just keep pretending that this is how it's always been? That the chaos is natural, that the blood is inevitable? Because it's not. It was engineered, funded, executed, and the people who did it are still in power. The Middle East didn't break itself. It was broken. Remember that.